Now, the second step on this roadmap has to do with managing the increase in personnel costs. Now, while the wages of public employees are equal and in some cases lower than their counterparts in the private sector, the projected increase in total compensation for public employees exceeds that of their private sector counterparts, largely due to the growth in healthcare costs and to the increased employer contribution in the PERS system. Now, these increases in public employee personnel costs contribute about 15% to the $3.5 billion problem that we face. Now, I want to repeat that and emphasize it. The growth in personnel costs, which was the central news story around the governor's reset report, account for 15% of the problem we face. That means that 85% of the problem is due to other factors: caseload growth, general inflation in goods and services, the loss of federal stimulus money. So my point is that while the growth in public employee personnel costs is important, must be dealt with, we can't balance the budget unless we do a whole lot of other things in a whole lot of other areas. Now, my overall policy in regard to public employee compensation is to eventually erase the artificial distinction between a public sector worker and a private sector worker and the divisive politics that have grown up around it, by reaching a point where the total compensation of a public worker or a private worker doing essentially the same thing in large labor markets is essentially comparable. Furthermore, I am committed to a strategy that will drive the total compensation for both public and private workers back up above the national average in every region of the state of Oregon. Now, there are two components involved with getting our arms around the increase in compensation costs. The first component involves tough collective bargaining with the state employees represented by state unions like AFSCME and SEIU. And the issues that have to be on the bargaining table are PERS, with particular emphasis on the increased employer contribution, the 6% pickup, if you will, step increases in cost of living adjustments, and value-based cost sharing in health care for public workers. I will seek to reduce the increase in total compensation costs for state workers through the collective bargaining process, and I will seek additional savings by ensuring that the compensation reductions for management are comparable to those of state workers. I will also seek to reduce the ratio of management to frontline workers and try to protect the incomes of our lowest paid state workers. Now, the second component of managing personnel costs involves the state school fund, which, as I mentioned earlier, pays for primary and secondary education. The challenge is that while the state pays for 70% of the cost of primary and secondary educations, decisions about how those resources are spent are made at the local level by independently elected school boards through local collective bargaining agreements. So my policy for 2011-2013 will be to place some expectations about how state resources will be used at the local level. In other words, while the agreements will continue to be negotiated at the local level, funding for the state school fund will be predicated on the compensation concessions that we get for state workers, and those will be hopefully passed on, at least in the overall amount of resources that we send down to the local level. Now, the third, fourth, and fifth steps in this roadmap involve identifying how services can be delivered more effectively and efficiently, and how additional resources can actually be produced within existing law. I will shortly be announcing two transition teams, one on increasing tax collections within our existing tax code by the Department of Revenue, the second one by reviewing and prioritizing our tax expenditures to look for ineffective, inefficient, or unjustifiable tax expenditures in light of our current fiscal situation. And the specific charges for both of those task forces, transition teams, are also included in your materials. In addition, I have been working with Secretary of State Kate Brown, who regularly does performance audits to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of state agencies. I've asked her to compile a list of the best audits over the past 10 years, and we're going to look to make sure to see whether or not they've been implemented, and work with her and the legislature to ensure compliance with those audits. We'll also work together to develop a prioritized set of audits going forward of those agencies that we put a high value on in terms of managing through the current budget crisis. The sixth step in this roadmap is to develop a 10-year budget. We have to move beyond managing Oregon 2 years at a time around a biennial budget. And developing a 10-year budget is a key element to make sure we stay the course long enough to shift the pattern of investments inside the general fund. So I will be appointing a transition team very shortly to essentially move us from a 2-year to a 10-year budget frame and to move us from the current service level approach to a true outcomes-based budgeting. And again, the charge and details for that transition team are also included in your materials. The 7th and last step on our strategy to balance our budget involves outcomes-based management. The fact is that today most state agencies don't have the performance metrics necessary to determine whether or not they're delivering the outcomes they're supposed to be delivering, and in many cases they don't have the capacity to collect the data that gives them an idea of what they're doing well and what they're not doing well. Furthermore, the current service level approach does not lend itself to outcome-based management and tends to reinforce the status quo. So to address that problem, I'm appointing a transition team chaired by Brett Wilcox, who's the CEO of Summit Power, and Dr. George Brown, who is the CEO of Legacy Health System, to develop a new set of budget and management tools within the existing authority of the legislative branch to evaluate program outcomes and to ensure better efficiency, effectiveness, transparency, and accountability for actually producing those outcomes. And again, a detailed description of that important charge is also included in your materials. Now, it's my intention to apply these tools across the breadth of state government, but I've asked this task force, this transition team, to start by focusing on the Department of Corrections, on the Oregon Youth Authority, and on the Department of Human Services, with the exception of healthcare services, which will be dealt with in our larger effort to reform the healthcare system. These programs account for about 25% of the general fund and constitute some of the most basic and important services that we provide here in the state. Finally, I think it's critical that government leaders, agency leaders, and program managers are aligned around the task of actually transforming Oregon state government, being accountable, and moving to an outcomes-based approach. To ensure that department heads and program managers agree with me on this new compact, I have requested letters of resignation from a number of key agency heads that I expect prior to January 10th. Now, this request does not mean that I've made a decision about who to rehire and not, and over the weeks ahead I will plan to meet with these individuals to discuss common priorities. I'm not requiring or asking for resignations of all state agencies at this time. This list, which should be included in your packet, represents my near-term priority of agency management review. Over time, my goal is to have in place agreements with all state agencies and agency heads, whether they report directly to the governor or whether they report to boards and commissions. These agreements will focus on the outcomes that we want for the state of Oregon and how we're best going to deliver them. So that, in a nutshell, is the strategy to work our way through this $3.5 billion budget. I don't for a minute pretend that it's going to be easy, and I think the key to making this work is to remind ourselves over and over and over again that we have to ask a different question. We have to stop asking, what do we have to cut? And we have to begin asking, how do we take the revenue that we know we have and invest it differently going forward to create the foundation for building a solid future for the state of Oregon? Be happy to answer any questions.